I call Sarah Edwards to move the motion. When you're ready.
It's an honour to serve under your chair, and I beg to move that this House has considered the transition to zero-emission vans. Vans are the workhorses of the UK economy, with 1 in 10 workers that rely on a van for their job across a range of industries, from engineering, construction, food delivery to emergency and rescue services. Many of these industries are the backbone of our economy, and we must support them as we make the journey to net zero. Currently, emissions from vans are increasing year on year. This is contributing to the detrimental impacts of climate change that we're seeing across the UK and globally. In my constituency of Tamworth, residents have been hit with flooding for centuries, but it is in recent decades that extreme flooding events are now becoming more common, and the flooding season is lasting now 3 months instead of 1, putting a huge strain on our rural economies, farmers and our food security. These floods, which have left those in our rural villages isolated and trapped, have been a key issue, blocking routes for vans and HGVs, with fleets forced to do 15-mile diversions just to be back on track. The devastating effect of climate change is impacting both residents and businesses, and we must take every step that we can to reduce emissions. And we must do this by using zero-emission vehicles. Since 1990, emissions across the UK fleet have risen by 63% by the increased use of diesel vans. In our bid to reach net zero, we must explore the challenges within this sector and address the limitations on infrastructure and the hurdles and higher costs. We must move some of our most polluting vehicles off our roads and move towards cleaner, more environmentally friendly vans. But we cannot do this unless there is a step change in the approach to investment and infrastructure, and we must make sure that we do not leave small and medium-sized enterprises behind in the process. In this debate, I shall be arguing that the 4.25-tonne e-vans should face the same rules and regulations as the 3.5-tonne diesel vans, and that more should be done to deal with the ad hoc installation of electric infrastructure needed to lay the foundations for the transition towards a net zero economy. Of course I will.
Commend the Honourable Lady for Tamworth for bringing this forward. I spoke to her before the debate started. I understand that the Honourable Lady is bringing something forward we all need to endorse right across this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. One of the things we should do, Mr Chairman and the Honourable Lady, is to encourage local councils, for instance, in the vans that they have, and they ensure they go electric fleet. But to make that happen, does the Honourable Lady agree that maybe government and the Minister needs to be involved in some way to ensure that there's incentives to make that happen, whether it be low finance deals or whether it be a grant to enable it to happen? Because if we get the councils to do it, then it makes it easier for the rest of us to follow.
Absolutely, and I thank the honourable member for his contribution. It is incredibly important that we involve councils because they can help a long way in making sure that that infrastructure is there and that they can actually fund some of the changes. So I think it's a well-made point, so I thank him for his contribution. Whilst the move to zero-emission vans is vital, it does not come without its challenges. Currently, the zero-emission van target sits at about 70% by 2030, and operators need support with this. Small and medium-sized enterprises are already struggling with the weight of increasing energy costs, so that in order to support them through this transition, there must be targeted incentives and a rollout of suitable infrastructure. But there is no protection from energy costs for businesses. Businesses in my constituency and across the country have seen their bills increase fourfold, with many going under as a result. Their energy rates are linked to credit ratings, and new businesses don't get the best rate until often year 3 onwards. And without the scrutiny that residential bills have had during the energy crisis, many business owners simply do not have the capital available to invest in greener solutions. If and when they do, they find that it is not just the cost, but the time for the grid upgrade to take place. And in some cases, businesses have been told that they cannot draw the power that is needed. Indeed, in my recent trip to visit Brakes in my constituency, who are the UK's leading wholesalers responsible for 70% of the food delivery to businesses and organisations including hospitals and care homes, and they operate 365 days a year on a just-in-time operation, they cited that they had made progress in installing chargers for their 7.5-tonne refrigerated vehicles, but wanted to go far further in their bid to go green. Battery technology at present is not able to provide enough power for both refrigeration and long distance, limiting the type of vans and trucks that can be used by the industry. They are unable to install additional green infrastructure due to the roof being unsuitable for solar installation and would struggle to draw the power needed from the grid for their ambitions at present. The grid's upgrade simply isn't possible. And so this is business ambition being stifled by the lack of infrastructure that they can tap into. The challenges with infrastructure, regulation, affordability and availability of suitable products is holding back businesses in their move towards EVans, which in turn slows down the laudable goal to reach net zero. A giant leap is therefore needed to move the market from the 5.9% of EVan sales which we saw last year for the UK to meet its emissions targets. The average EVan costs around 50% more than a diesel option, which is a huge financial burden to a small or medium-sized enterprise who are keen to move towards greener ways of working, but are struggling to bear the upfront costs of these new vans and the uncertain energy costs. Diesel options are outperforming the EVans currently on the market from range, charging speed, and operators paying more for less. Whilst running costs can be lower, these are being undermined by huge costs in charging at public charging stations. My constituent David Fennell from Evolution explained that the installation of EV chargers often requires upgrades to power supplies that can be costly and can take months to complete, and in some cases years, to bring a power supply up to the standard ready for the installation for EV charging. There are limited incentives for small businesses to install this type of infrastructure, with larger private companies often bridging that gap, getting energy supplies up to the standard needed. At present, schools are receiving a higher incentive for the installation of charging infrastructure, whereas commercial premises are receiving a much smaller incentive through the workplace charging scheme. You can get 75% off the cost of a buy and install of a charge point, up to a maximum of £2,500 per socket. And in contrast, the EV infrastructure grant for small and medium-sized enterprises gives you money off the cost of wider building and installation work, and that's needed to install multiple charge points. The grant covers 75% of the cost of the work up to £15,000, and you can get £350 per charge point of socket installed, and up to £500 per parking space enabled with supporting infrastructure. Whilst this grant is a good step, it's not considered large enough to incentivise SMEs to take the risk and financial burden of installation and transition to net zero. If we are to move towards the widespread use of zero-emission vans, we must ensure that infrastructure such as charging facilities are available and affordable, and crucially in the right places. The burden of cost for both the installation of EV chargers and the upgrade to power for EV vans falls at the feet of small and medium enterprises, which is no way to drive our journey to net zero to grow our economy. We need a spatial strategy to assist with this, which doesn't rely upon solely the private sector and those who may have the capital to invest. In the 2023 Logistic UK Van Report, a third of correspondents cited power supply infrastructure as one of their biggest challenges for fleet electrification. A large percentage of van users don't have access to a home driveway to charge, and often public charging bays are not physically designed for vans. There are also nitty-gritty challenges, such as a lack of standardisation of payment methods and the inability to pre-book specialised bays. As a result, there is uncertainty for businesses around their ability to keep their vans on the road and moving. Many businesses, particularly our SMEs, need the highest levels of confidence that their vans will be on the road and earning throughout the day. Many businesses, particularly SMEs, need the highest levels, for those fortunate enough to access private charging options, the cost of grid connection upgrades, the complexities of landlord sign-off and planning approval processes can cause issues. Both access to power and its cost are key challenges in this debate and can be difficult obstacles to overcome. These challenges are not limited to the transition for zero-emission vans. The logistics industry is essential to our economy, and many operate fleets of varying size of vehicle and provide different coverage for different parts of the business operation. The heavy goods sector currently accounts for just under 20% of UK transport CO2 emissions, yet only 0.8% of HGV fleets are zero emission. For HGV fleets, there are very limited options for the heaviest vehicles, and those that are available are expensive. The Road Haulage Association anticipates that the overall cost of decarbonisation for HGVs will likely exceed £100 billion. Electric trucks are at least 3 times the price of an equivalent diesel. The Road Haulage Association also estimates that up to £2 billion of investment in the energy infrastructure is needed to power zero-emission vehicles. And since 2014, the logistics sector has invested an additional $2.2 billion in new HG fleets to reduce their nitrogen oxide pollution, and they want to look to replicate this for CO2 emissions. But there's a lot of work to do when the target for phasing out new diesel HGVs below 26 tonnes is 2035, and for all HGVs it is 2040. Regulation is also a big challenge in this transition, in particular around the weight of vehicles. A battery is heavier than fuel, and for EVans to be able to perform like diesel, they will be heavier in weight. 4.25-tonne EVans also face HGV MOTs because their weight tips them into that next category of commercial vehicle. And this regulation is placing significant burden and additional expense on operators, impacting their downtime. And it also means that there is less choice and flexibility as fewer testers are qualified to MOT a HGV. Currently, logistics companies are arguing that 4.25-tonne EVans should face the same rules and regulations as 3.5-tonne diesel vans. They're delivering the same amount of goods, but the battery puts them outside of the current legislative parameters. These vehicles are now classed as HGVs, meaning that they must be driven by a fleet with an operator licence, and those driving must have HGV qualifications, which costs money and time in training, and they must be kept up to date. These are safety requirements that no one wishes to be removed for HGVs, but the technical point of the weight difference between the E-van and the standard diesel van should be reconsidered as a large financial barrier to what externally looks to be an identical vehicle. It is important that these issues are considered by members of the House and noted as a policy that has limited the transition to zero-emission vans. There are various countries who are successfully leading the way in transition to electric vehicles. The Netherlands' van share is currently more than double that of the UK. Their clear policy framework for urban logistics has introduced a number of zero-emission logistic zones, starting from January in 2025. And as a result of this, the wider policies that support the transition of the Netherlands is leading the way among European countries for electric van uptake. We're seeing a similar use of policy in the US. Currently, the US is supporting the transition to electric vehicles under the EV Acceleration Challenge. Since 2021, electrical vehicle sales have tripled in the US, and the number of publicly available charging ports has grown by over 40%. The US's Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 has added and expanded tax credits for purchases of new and electric vehicles, and the Act provides a $7,500 tax credit for every new green vehicle purchased by a taxpayer, of up to £14,000, which equates to approximately 6.3 metric tonnes. Over that weight, it's £40,000 per vehicle. The UK could consider if, in order to get growth, we need additional support for businesses who are assisting the government in their ambition for a greener economy that promotes growth throughout the UK. And if we are to successfully transition to zero-emission vans, we must consider the blueprints laid in other countries and their successes and failures as the UK plans for growth. In closing, whilst we can incentivise businesses to move towards the use of zero-emission vans, we must ensure that there is sufficient infrastructure, legislation and policy in place to support this. The challenges around charging facilities, cost and infrastructure are large but not insurmountable, especially when the earlier that we invest, the earlier the payback begins. And the new partnership between this government and businesses could help transform the van sector, tackling a huge environmental impact and growing our economy. I thank the members for their contributions to this debate and to the House for its consideration of this important topic.
Can I remind backbench members, if you're intending to speak in this debate, you should stand in your place to give the Chair a chance of knowing who is intending to contribute. The question is that this House has considered the transition to zero-emission vans. Chris Blower.
Thank you, Mr Efford, for your chairmanship, and thank you to the Honourable Member for Tamworth. My remarks will be brief, as the Honourable Member for Tamworth covered much what I was going to say as well. But I really want to make clear this point about making it easier for the infrastructure in this country to be there for businesses to take advantage of electrifications. We must make it easier, quicker and cheaper to install charging points that are suitable for vans. In the Logistics UK Van Report 2023, a third of respondents cited power supply infrastructure as one of their biggest challenges for fleet electrification. And the physical layout themselves of public charging spaces are often designed for cars, not vans, meaning that even if there is a charging point, most van users are missing out. I welcome the consultation over the summer on the first electric vehicle charging infrastructure strategy for Worcestershire, which will set out how my county council and its partners intend to support the transition to electric vehicles. But agree with my honourable friend that we must do more to encourage small businesses to be able to install charging points that are fit for the future. We've heard from many colleagues before here about the vital role vans play in our businesses across the country, and their contribution to the electrification of them would have in meeting our net zero targets. In her response, I hope the Minister will be able to give an assessment of the current charging infrastructure in the country and its ability to meet electric fleet and e-van business operations in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Efford. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the member for Tamworth for securing this important debate. As we've heard from the other speakers today, the current state of electric van rollout is simply not good enough. We are way behind what's needed to meet the target of 100% electric vehicle sales by 2035. Currently, less than 2% of light good vehicles are electric, while so far this year, little more than 5% of new registrations are electric. That's behind not just the government's own zero-emission vehicle mandate of 10%, but also behind what's being achieved in comparable European countries, as we've heard in the Netherlands, but also Germany and France. Things are not improving. With worrying signs, the industry is stagnating. Since July, new electric van registrations have fallen every single month. As the Climate Change Committee outlined last week, urgent action is needed for us to meet our national defined contributions under the Paris Agreement. There's no time to delay. Transport is still the largest single emitter of greenhouse gases in the UK, responsible for 26% of the UK's total emissions in 2021. Decarbonisation of the sector is consequently critical to us meeting our targets. There is no doubt the government has inherited a mess. Broken promises and mixed messages from the previous government discouraged businesses from the investment needed to transition to electric vehicles. Not only did the Conservatives roll back on some of the commitments they made, they also failed to keep the commitments they retained. In March 2022, the government of the day set out a target for 300,000 public charge points across the UK by 2030. But by the end of their term, only 60,000 had been built, way behind the rate of growth needed to meet their target. However, the new government cannot simply blame their predecessors. They are serious about meeting our international commitments. Urgent steps will be taken now. Currently, the charging network, particularly rapid charging, is too poor for many businesses to feel confident in investing in electric vehicles. This is exacerbated by the current market, with very few vans, less than 20% of models available, having a range in excess of 200 miles, with even basic models costing, as we've heard, far more than their petrol or diesel equivalents. Admittedly, the government cannot dictate to the market, but surely they can take steps to help the situation. Increasing charging capacity across the network, with an increase in both on-street points and ultra-fast chargers at service stations, is vital to increasing business confidence in EVs. Particularly rapid chargers, which are vital for businesses who cannot afford to waste hours waiting for vehicles to charge. We also need clarity on what support will be given to businesses converting to electric vans in the future. The government currently gives a plug-in van grant of up to £2,500 for small vans and £5,000 for larger vans, but the subsidy is due to end next year. Will the Minister confirm that the scheme can be extended? Vans are vital to our economy and employment, with 1 in 10 people relying on a van for their everyday work. In order to meet our climate commitments, the government needs to put their foot on the accelerator and work with businesses in transitioning to electric vehicles. Urgent steps are needed, and I hope the Minister will confirm they are finally coming. Thank you.
Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Efferman. A pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. And may I start by congratulating the Honourable Lady for Tamworth, not least on securing the debate, but for her very thoughtful and well laid out speech, covering a whole range of really, really important issues, and it's a credit to the way she's brought this debate today. And I hope that in that spirit, the Minister and I can have a positive interaction and try and get some answers. So, because vans, I know we can all agree, play an integral role in our economy. And if the UK is to decarbonise successfully, vans will need to play a central role. But any measures in service of this welcome transition must offer a pragmatic and reasonable way forward, which the Honourable Lady outlined so well. And that must be key to remember that too speedy a transition to electric vehicles can present challenges that we may not yet be ready to address. Now, I think it's probably no surprise that I want to draw attention here, firstly, to the manner of measures taken by the last Conservative government, having spent over £2 billion to transition the UK to zero-emission vehicle use. And I note here that as of November 2023, the plug-in van grant alone has supported over 40,000 electric vans and HEVs across the UK. The last government also acknowledged the challenges presented by battery warranty requirements and amended battery warranty capacities, which was a welcome move. In 2023, the Department for Transport as well took the very welcome step of announcing that the additional 5-hour training requirement for drivers would be removed, and it would make changes to towing allowances for vehicles, vans weighing up to 4.25 tonnes. And I know, again, the Honourable Lady touched on some of these very important issues that face the industry. So, in this spirit, I urge today's government then to continue this work and listen to the sector. Specifically, I would ask the Minister whether the government intends to retain the changes I mentioned and whether she'll commit to the renewal of the plug-in van grant set to expire at the end of March 2025. Because it is critical the government continues on the route established by the previous government and not to get too tied up in any longer-term reviews that may hold up as we move forward. And I know the Honourable Lady, the Minister, has a wide experience in transport issues in her previous role and will be well across these very important issues. I think the industry and drivers would much more appreciate certainty as to what measures the government intends to retain and what action it intends to undertake. And I hope the Minister will be able to offer some specificity. I also hope that the government will commit to engage with industry on a range of issues, including MOT testing and drivers' hours, to further understand how the government can pragmatically remove barriers to aid decarbonisation of fleets. And as the Honourable Lady quite rightly touched on, the infrastructure is crucial. As of May 2024, the government, in collaboration with the industry, had supported the installation of over 61,000 public available charging devices, and this included more than 10,000 rapid charge points. The Honourable Lady spoke very widely about being able to actually charge the vehicles and the infrastructure that was involved. And indeed, that is a very important point, but also there is the point of being able to generate the electricity that is going to be needed, even if the infrastructure is in place. So I would ask the Honourable Lady, the Minister, whether she is intended to have that wider conversation with the Energy Secretary about how quickly the building of new turbine-run power stations will be up and running to try and meet this demand, as well as obviously the infrastructure that needs to be put in place. To reach 300,000 chargers by 2030, the number of public charge points installed annually must continue to grow by around 30%. Can the Minister confirm whether the government has plans to maintain this growth year on year? And finally, but of central importance, given the government has confirmed it's moving the date for new petrol and diesel vehicles back to 2030, can the Minister provide clarity on the timeline for vans? Now, changes must be pragmatic. The Honourable Lady from Tamworth will not be aware, I shouldn't have thought, that I sat on the energy bill in the last Parliament, and very much made the point all the time that it has to be a pragmatic approach that takes the public with us. And therefore, in that spirit, I asked the Minister to reflect on how this can be achieved and communicated with and properly undertaken. And also how the concerns will be addressed with the potential cost that may be put on businesses in terms of new employment laws, and whether that is one of the unseen consequentials after the budget that may stop some of that investment. So really just making that holistic request to looking at all the different areas of where small businesses especially may be looking to invest this area. I hope the Minister will be able to provide some clarity on the questions I've posed, and I'd once again like to congratulate the Honourable Lady for Tamworth for a very well thought out speech. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr Efford. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship once again, and so soon as well. I'm delighted to respond to this important debate, and I congratulate my honourable friend, who I know has recently passed her first anniversary in this House and is proving a great champion for the people of Tamworth. So congratulations on securing the debate and for setting out the challenges of the transition to zero-emission vehicles so succinctly. And I also thank other honourable and right honourable members who've spoken today and made important contributions. I'll summarise the actions this government is taking to address some of the issues raised. So the transition to electric vehicles is crucial to achieving the UK's net zero target by 2050, as well as the environmental benefits, including lower carbon emissions, better air quality and reduced noise. This transition will help us to kickstart the economy and make Britain a clean energy superpower. Now, transport remains the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. The domestic transport sector produced a staggering 28% of the UK's total emissions in 2022, and it's road transport that is responsible for 89% of those emissions, vans 19% of road transport emissions. So the challenge of eliminating that carbon and shifting to clean, green vehicles is immense, but it's also a huge opportunity for British manufacturers. Zero-emission vans will be at the heart of the global economy, and making them in Britain will deliver well-paid green jobs for generations to come. To achieve this, we must ensure that there's certainty for industry and for consumers, so manufacturers have the confidence to invest and build vehicles right here in the UK, and consumers have the confidence to switch. And when I talk about consumers, I don't just mean individual drivers, but of course fleets and operators. To provide this certainty, we've stated our intention to phase out the sale of new cars solely powered by internal combustion engines by 2030. And we'll set out further details for reducing emissions from vans in due course. But all new cars and vans will need to be zero emission by 2035. And of course, that's no change from the plan under the previous government. And there is a clear plan to get us from where we are today to where we need to be in a decade's time. The zero-emission vehicle mandate sets annual targets for vehicle manufacturers for the registration of new zero-emission cars and vans. These targets provide a clear investment signal to vehicle manufacturers and the charge point industry. And the Honourable Member for Strangford, who's no longer in his place, will be aware that the mandate is now being extended to also cover Northern Ireland. The target for vans rise annually from 10% this year to 70% in 2030, and these were determined in close consultation with vehicle manufacturers. This government recognises that the ZEV mandate targets are particularly challenging for vans. Industry figures for the year to September suggest that zero-emission vans account for 6.2% of sales. They reached But I agree with the honourable member that they have remained steady at around 5% across 2023 and 2024. Clearly, we have further to go, and that's why vans receive additional flexibilities compared to cars under the ZEV mandate. Van manufacturers in 2024 can defer 90% of the target in this year to later years, and that means that they can choose to sell fewer zero-emission vans this year in exchange for selling more in future years as demand reaches critical mass and as there are more models available and potentially, hopefully, prices coming down. Manufacturers can also use the carbon dioxide conversion flexibility, which allows them to sell fewer zero-emission vans in exchange for reducing average emissions across their new non-zero emission vans, so producing ICE vans that are less polluting. This means that vehicle manufacturers can meet the requirements of the mandate without incurring fines, even if they don't achieve 10% of new van sales this year. But of course, we want to help industry to reach those targets. And that's why the government provides incentives to support the uptake of zero-emission vans and trucks. Now, the plug-in vehicle grants help to reduce the upfront purchase cost of vans and trucks. And since 2012, these grants have supported over 110,000 vans and heavy goods vehicles across the UK. I should say that the plug-in grants are kept under review, and the government has been clear that these grants will eventually end, but I'm constantly looking at that and in order to make sure that we can achieve our aspirations. When it comes to HGVs, as my honourable friend also mentioned, the phase-out dates for new non-zero emission trucks are 2035 for those up to 26 tonnes and 2040 for those above. The government remains technology neutral, investing in both hydrogen and battery electrification. And that's why the government is providing up to £200 million as part of the Zero Emission HGV and Infrastructure Demonstrator Programme. This programme will build sector confidence in the capabilities of the heaviest HGVs, 40 to 44 tonnes, by supporting hundreds of battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell HGVs and kick-starting the deployment of the charging and fuelling sites. Indeed, I got to ride in a battery electric HGV recently as part of a visit to Scania. The vehicles are here. They're not in a test phase, but they're very real and available for deployment. And I have to say, my driver was very enthusiastic about the experience of driving an electric HGV, which, as anyone who's driven an electric vehicle know, can accelerate really well, which also is important for safety when you're trying to pull on and off roads. So we are already acting to make it as easy as possible for operators to make the switch to zero-emission vans. Flexibilities are already in place around driver and operator licensing to align regulations for heavier electric vans with their petrol and diesel equivalents. As my honourable friend said, they look exactly the same. Now, standard licence holders can already drive alternatively fuelled goods vehicles up to 4.25 tonnes rather than the usual 3.5 tonnes, provided the driver has completed 5 hours of additional training. And alternatively fuelled vehicles up to 4.25 tonnes are also exempt from the need for operator licences, which place additional operational requirements on organisations which operate vehicles above 3.5 tonnes. Now, there was, as the Right Honourable Member said, a consultation previously seeking views on the removal of the additional requirements for alternatively fuelled vehicles to access the driving licence flexibility. And that included the additional 5 hours of training, the types of vehicles eligible for the flexibility and the towing allowance. The consultation also sought views on limiting the flexibility to zero-emission vehicles only. Now, responses were mostly in favour of the changes, and the government is now considering options to make it easier for both drivers and operators to move to zero-emission vans. So we are continuing work that the previous government had done in that respect. We're also reviewing options for amending roadworthiness or MOT testing, as well as driver's hours, tachograph and speed limiter rules for these heavier zero-emission vans. Now, of course, the government takes road safety very seriously, and reducing those killed and seriously injured on our roads is a key priority. Road safety is therefore a primary consideration in assessing any changes to regulatory weight thresholds. We recognise so let me turn now to issues around charging infrastructure, because we recognise that van and fleet drivers are likely to rely on public charging infrastructure. Their needs can differ from those of private drivers due to several factors, including shift work, long journeys and the need for flexibility. And indeed, as my honourable friend said, some of those vans also require refrigeration units too. There are already 70,000 publicly available charging devices in the UK, and that's a 42% year-on-year increase. And the challenge is to continue to deliver at that rate. For drivers who park near their home, the Local Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Fund is delivering over £380 million in capital and resource funding to support local authorities to deliver the rollout of tens of thousands of local charge points. And these will support van and fleet drivers without off-street parking, helping them to charge close to home. My honourable friend's local authority, Staffordshire County Council, has been allocated over £5 million in that Levi funding, and that will help Staffordshire to work with industry to transform the availability of charging infrastructure for their residents without off-street parking, including those who need to charge a van outside their home. Now, cross-pavement solutions can also provide a permanent option to safely charge an EV on the street outside a driver's home. And we're looking at how we can support local authorities to help people access these solutions. And eligible van and fleet drivers who wish to install a cross-pavement solution can benefit from the government's electric vehicle charge point grant. And just to pick up the question that came from the Honourable Member for Redditch is around perhaps charging spaces being not appropriately set out for vans, is we are continuing to communicate with charging providers about the importance of them being accessible for van drivers. And our work with the British Standards Institute on accessible charging infrastructure will also support larger bays. Now, charge point provision along the strategic road network, so our motorways and A roads, has significantly improved in recent years, and those are essential for supporting drivers making long-distance journeys. There are now more than 960 open access, rapid and ultra-rapid charge points at motorway service areas across England, and many more on or close to our key A roads. The quality of charge points is also improving. The public charge point regulations were introduced in November last year, and these already require all charge points to provide clear and consistent information, enabling customers to easily compare prices. Additional requirements from the end of November this year will enable van drivers and indeed all consumers to get free, up-to-date information about charge point availability, access a 24/7 free helpline, bless you, and expect 99% reliability across each rapid charging network. And the contactless payment requirement will also simplify payments at many public charge points, including all rapid charge points, eliminating the need for drivers to use a multiplicity of apps. These regulations will improve the charging experience for all drivers, but particularly commercial drivers who spend the most time out on the roads. Now, my honourable friend asked about the workplace charging scheme grant, and that continues to provide support for businesses, charities and public sector organisations to install charge points. Since 2016, it's supported over 55,000 workplaces and offers up to £350, capped at 75%, as she said, towards the purchase and installation of charge point sockets. However, this government knows that in order to give the public confidence in making the switch to electric vans, then they need to feel confident in their ability to charge those vehicles, whether that's at home or at the depot or on the road. And we recognise that more needs to be done. That's why we've committed to accelerating the rollout of charging infrastructure. And we're currently considering the most effective ways of doing this, and we'll have more to say on that in due course. But we do recognise that grid connections continue to be a major obstacle for those wishing to make the switch to electric vehicles. My honourable friend illustrated the challenge for an example business in her constituency, and we know there's a need for significant reform to the grid connections process. And that's why we're working with Ofgem and the network companies to make the grid connections process easier. And of course there's a need to increase electricity generation more broadly as well. This government has a plan to deliver the UK's transition to zero emission vans by maintaining our ambitious but achievable ZEV mandate targets, by reviewing measures to make zero-emission vans as accessible as possible, and by accelerating the rollout of charging infrastructure. We'll continue to work very closely with fleet operators, with individual organisations and their trade associations to understand the barriers to the uptake of zero-emission vans and to work together to identify solutions to help overcome them. I once again thank my honourable friend, the member for Tamworth, for leading this important debate, and I'd also like to thank the other honourable members who've also contributed today. Thank you.
Sarah Evans.
Thank you. I ask that the committee approve the consideration of the transition to net zero. Thank you.
Right. Okay. The question is that the House has considered the transition to zero-emission vans. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order. The sit-in is adjourned.